Mr. Nainal, who was supposed to chair and moderate the session today, unfortunately, at the last minute he had a medical problem and he was not able to come. So I would be requesting Professor Hoda only to moderate the session. Professor Hoda, of course, needs no introduction. He has worked in the Commerce Ministry, he has worked in WTO, he has worked in the Planning Commission, and now he has been in ICRIER working on these issues. So he has a well-rounded perspective on these issues, and I think all of us are eager to listen to him as to what is the way forward out of the impasse that has been created in the trade talks. Jayant Das Gupta also is very well known. He was till recently our ambassador to the WTO, and he has come back only about 6 months back. So he is fresh from the battlefield, and he will bring his own perspective to this knotty problem. I am also thankful to Mr. H.K. Singh for having joined us at very short notice. It's indeed very gracious of him to have come at such short notice and would help us in the proceedings today. With these words, I would now request Professor Hoda to take over the session and give us his viewpoint on this very interesting and important subject. Thank you.
I don't think I have to do anything to take over the moderation of this session, but straight away proceed with what I think is the way forward from this present impasse. As many of you are already fully familiar with the negotiations, with the trade talks that happen in Geneva and elsewhere, you know that deadlocks are quite common in these talks. And the public is quite familiar with hearing about deadlocks whenever they hear about trade talks. The norm at these talks, trade talks, is for the first a deadlock develops, and then there is a pause, and then after a pause a solution is found and the talks move forward. One of the biggest deadlocks that I have experienced, one to which I think Ambassador Sajanhar, who is here, was also a party, was the deadlock that happened in the 80s when the developed countries wanted multilateral disciplines to be extended to cover services and intellectual property rights. Now this was a very big deadlock. For years together there was disagreement amongst most of the developing countries and the developed countries in one group. However, the seemingly deep differences were resolved in a matter of about 8 years, and the WTO was born, covering disciplines under one roof on goods, services, and intellectual property rights. After the birth of WTO, unfortunately, deadlocks have become more common. In fact, after July 2008, when talks broke down at Geneva, there has been no progress in the trade talks, and there has been a lengthening sort of gloom over the trade talks. In this gloom, the appearance on the horizon of the possibility of an agreement on trade facilitation gave a ray of hope. Even though trade facilitation was not regarded as a big ticket liberalization action at the outset, gradually it came to be seen as having a highly positive effect on the expansion of trade. You know that the traditional barriers to trade have come down, and the next frontier, particularly in developing countries, is the infrastructure and the processes that determine the speed with which the incoming and outgoing goods go across the border. Analysts have come to the conclusion that a week's extra time in transit or processing can result in costs broadly equal to 10% tariffs. The whole objective of trade facilitation and of facilitating agreement that has been agreed, nearly agreed in the trade talks is to reduce the opportunities for delay, and this is being considered as something that is equal to liberalization of tariffs and other restrictions. In view of the widely perceived benefits of the trade facilitation agreement, the WTO members started working towards such an agreement being adopted at the ministerial meeting of the WTO, which was scheduled to take place at Bali in December 2013, last year. However, the passage towards such an agreement was difficult. Many developing countries, including the group of 33, of which India is a member, thought that the trade facilitation agreement was something that was principally of interest to the developed countries. And they said that if this agreement is to go forward, then some of our difficulties should also be resolved. They insisted on the resolution in particular of what they thought was severe difficulty in safeguarding their food security because of certain provisions in the agreement on agriculture. After a crisis at Bali, agreement was eventually reached. That period would be granted disputes in regard, and in the meantime, a permanent solution will be worked out on the issue. The agreement at Bali, when it was finalized in December last year, appeared to be stable, and it looked as if the agreement, at least particularly on trade facilitation, would be a stepping stone for a positive outcome in other areas in the Doha round, in which the negotiations had remained stuck. There was some enthusiasm in trade circles that there would be progress in the long delayed Doha round as well. What happened then? The next step was supposed to be the approval by the members of the WTO of a protocol of amendment which would integrate the trade facilitation agreement into the WTO agreement. The ministers had mandated that the General Council, this is the top body of the WTO, would meet no later than the 31st of July 2014, this year, to adopt the protocol. However, on that day, the Director General of WTO reported that members had been unable to reach consensus on the adoption of the protocol which would have formalized the agreement on trade facilitation. India was one of a handful of countries which withheld consent. The main reason for this was the assessment that was made in the Indian government that there was insufficient political will in the major players to find a permanent solution on the problems in the agreement on agriculture, which created difficulties for public stock holdings of food stocks. In their view, the trade facilitation agreement, if it entered into, once the trade facilitation agreement entered into force, India and other like-minded countries would lose the bargaining lever that had enabled them to compel the membership to give attention to the problem. And so, India pleaded that a permanent solution must be found simultaneously with the adoption of the Protocol Amendment for the TFA, Trade Facilitation Agreement. Now, India has faced unprecedented opprobrium from the international community for withholding consent for two reasons. First, because it has reversed the commitment that it had expressed multilaterally only a few months back at Bali. And second, because it has impeded the fruition of the only multilateral agreement that has been successfully negotiated in the last 15 years or so. Much hope was pinned on the Obama-Modi meeting, which was scheduled last month, and had raised expectations across the world that a resolution of the issue would make progress. But it didn't. The September 30 joint statement only notes that the leaders discussed the current impasse and directed their officials to consult on the next steps. The representatives at Geneva returned for after the summer break and met on October 16th, but their statements only reflected the litany of discord that they had shown before the summer break. Now, I'm not here to discuss whether India was right or wrong in withholding consent from the Protocol of Amendment. But I want to give my views on what is the way forward. Since India has taken the view that the agreement on agriculture is a serious threat to its food security, some of the provisions in that agreement, my view is that it must be proactive in making proposals to resolve the issue. It can be of little comfort to India that as long as the issue of public stock holding is not resolved, the trade facilitation agreement cannot enter into force. Solutions cannot drop from above simply because we have put obstacles in the way of what others want. Nor can India rely on the set of proposals that the group of 33 has put forward during 2013. Some of them do not respond to our interest. The new proposals that India must make have to be designed to achieve our own objectives, but should also be responsive to the sensitivities of our major trading partners and should fall within the range of acceptability by them. The way out of the deadlock is for India to take the lead in showing the way. The origin of the problem is that the WTO agreement caps the agriculture subsidy of each member at the level that existed before the entry into force of the WTO agreement. In countries in which the subsidy was provided through market price support, the benchmark for determining the level of subsidization is the fixed external price for the period 86-88 for each product. The crucial point is that the benchmark is fixed in nominal terms. There does not seem to be flexibility for inflation when the member concerned notifies its level of subsidy. We must note, however, there is an article in the Agreement on Agriculture which says that members shall give consideration to the excessive rates of inflation on the ability of members to abide by its domestic support commitments. But there is no consideration, no clarity on what due consideration implies and when the rates of inflation can be considered to be excessive. These ambiguities probably created the sense of uncertainty in India and other countries, which led to their creating a crisis. In order to overcome the problems arising from the language of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, the group of 33 countries had made a number of proposals in the run-up to the ministerial meeting. These proposals reflected suggestions that the developing countries should be able to subsidize more. And in some cases, there was a suggestion that the permission to subsidize more should be open-ended. There is that 10% limit. There were suggestions that the 10% limit should be set aside, and so on. But none of these proposals could get accepted. In making fresh proposals, India must bear in mind the experience with proposals made earlier by the G33. These proposals did not get accepted because they sought far greater flexibility for developing country members to subsidize. Any similar proposal which suggests amendments in the agreement of the agriculture with a view to providing developing countries to increase the level of trade distorting subsidization would be seen as a retrograde move, and would surely meet the same fate. Only those proposals which seek to build on the language and concepts already embodied in the text are likely to go forward. Now, in the end, we have to return to Article 18.4, to which I have referred, and hopefully I will be displaying it on the board towards the end of my talk. There are a number of reasons for suggesting that we should go back to this article to find a solution. The Agreement on Agriculture no doubt stipulates that the fixed external reference price must be in nominal terms, but there are reasons to infer that these relevant provisions were conceived of in temporary terms. The WTO agreement having come into force in 1995, we have to remember that a second round of negotiations on agriculture was envisaged in 5 years' time. Surely, a provision to fix the benchmark in nominal terms for 20 or 30 years or in perpetuity would not have been reasonable. Members must surely have had a short time frame, a time horizon in mind. While the aim of the negotiators was to ensure that the large balance of AMS in monetary terms that the major players like the EU had, sorry for that. that you had would be eroded through the process of inflation. This certainly could not have been the objective in respect of the large majority of developing countries which are not subsidizing during the years 1986-88. The language of the article contains a clear mandate for due consideration to be given to the influence of excessive levels of inflation when the Committee on Agriculture carries out its review process of compliance of obligations. Article 18.4, which is the article I am referring to, seems to suggest a case-by-case application, case-by-case approach in applying the provision to the members. How? Such an approach would seem to be the antithesis of a transparent and rule-based multilateral trading system that the WTO framework embodies. If an attempt is made to render the provisions into a set of multilateral principles defining such terms as due consideration and the influence of excessive rates of inflation, the expectation should be that all members would cooperate. In actual practice, members have invoked Article 18.4 while notifying their domestic support, which has been affected by inflation. As many as 8 members have referred to the article, and there has not really been a problem. The inflation that they have taken into account and made adjustments in their domestic support has been accepted. Now, looking at the records of the meetings of the Committee of Agriculture in which these requests have been considered for taking inflation into account, one would see that members have more or less agreed with the requests to take inflation into account. They have sometimes sort of insisted that you cannot do it yourself. I mean, you cannot index the domestic support to inflation yourself, but you have to submit the facts and the movement of prices and the rates of inflation to the committee for their consideration. But other than that, they have accepted in principle that this can be done. Members have been disinclined to define what might be regarded as excessive rates of inflation. But some members have maintained that excessive rates means any level of inflation which has sufficient influence to push a member beyond the domestic support, domestic support commitment level. Some others have insisted that the cumulative level of inflation over 10, 20 years or more should be taken into consideration. Taking all these aspects into account, it seems to me that India should propose that in cases in which a WTO member had product-specific support less than the de minimis percentage of 10% in any particular product during the base period, due consideration in Article 18.4 of the Agreement on Agriculture should be interpreted to mean full adjustment. What should be regarded as excessive levels of inflation in such cases, since these countries had no subsidies during the base period, there is no case to expect them to absorb the effects of any future inflation at all. If there is agreement on these proposals, India's MSP, that is minimum support price for rice and wheat, will be WTO compliant up to 2013-14, because the external reference prices corrected for inflation is higher than the minimum support price. In fact, the minimum support price without any correction, this is important point, is also generally below the prevailing international price. This is so because one of the considerations for the recommendations that the Commission on Agriculture Costs and Prices makes is that the MSP should not be out of line from the international price, of the international price. From the economic standpoint, a country can be deemed to be subsidizing production of any commodity only if it is supporting a price level that is higher than the international price. In fact, this is what some of the industrialized countries were doing in the pre-WTO era. And this is what led to the reforms embodied in the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. This brings me to an alternative. The first proposal, as I explained, is to render the provisions of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture in multilaterally transparent terms. And the second proposal is that India should make is that as long as the administered prices are set at rates that are not above the international market price, they should be deemed to be in compliance with the WTO commitments. So, what I am saying as the way forward for resolving the impasse in world trade talks. Can you put the slide on the thing? I am just recapitulating. What I am saying is, first, that let India take the lead in proposing the way out, which is what India is not doing at present. Now look at the Article 18.4, which is the main article which deals with inflation. In the review process, members shall give due consideration to the influence of excessive rates of inflation and so on and so forth. Now this is something that is totally, the language of this article is totally repugnant to the spirit of multilateral rules, because it seems to suggest a case-by-case approach. Now I think what India should propose is that a decision should be taken under Article 18.4, which translates the case-by-case approach into a set of multilaterally agreed principles. Then the third point that I would like to make. You know, originally the intention was that inflation would erode into the commitments made by the WTO members. But that was against the background of the fact that the countries like the European Union and some others had high levels of subsidies. In some cases, the subsidies prevalent in 86-88 was as much as 75% of the value of production. In India's case, India had no subsidy at that time. In fact, India's domestic support price was much lower than the international price. So its support was a negative. So what I am proposing is that in the multilaterally agreed principles that should replace Article 18.4, we should suggest that there should be no expectation that the developing countries which did not have subsidies at that time, at the outset, should not be expected to absorb any inflation in future. They should be provided with full adjustment for inflation in the administered price in future. Then, if you look at the other table that is before you. This shows the relationship between India's MSP in the last 6 years and the support price. You'll find that except in one case, in the case of wheat, I think in 2009-10, India's support price, that is MSP, is far lower than the international price. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that one of the reasons why the WTO agreement on agriculture was negotiated was that at that time, in the pre-WTO era, many developed countries were supporting prices well above the international price. I remember that in some cases, the price of commodities supported in the European Union, for instance, was 400% of the international price. The whole idea of the WTO was to make them bring down the support price to the international level. But where the support price is already below the international level, as in India's case, it is demonstrated right in front of you, then there cannot be any assumption that there is a subsidy. I think this should be the alternative proposal that India should make. So let me just recapitulate. First, that in order to find a way out of the impasse, India should move forward and make the proposals, which it is not doing at present. What should be the constituent parts of this proposal? First, that in place of the Article 18.4, which envisages a case-by-case approach in the event of inflation, there should be a multilaterally agreed set of rules. And second, in these rules, the countries that had not been subsidizing at the time the WTO came into force should not be asked to, should be given full adjustment for any inflation that takes place. And the last element is that irrespective of whatever the agreement on agriculture contains, if a country's support price on any commodity is less than the prevailing international price, the assumption should be that the country is not subsidizing at all. That's all that I have to pose for the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hoda, for that very scholarly and comprehensive presentation about the issues. I fully endorse the points that Professor Hoda has made about the way forward, but I will have occasion later on in my presentation to speak about the prognosis that I personally have about the situation, which I would like to share with you. On the first point about the way forward, it is very well known that this whole problem stems from the lack of inflation adjustment. Now, if you have something which was fixed in 1986-88, and for rice, it was the external reference price against which a subsidy is being calculated today. The external reference price is 3.52 rupees per kilogram of rice. Today, the minimum support price in nominal terms for grade A rice works out to 21 rupees. So if you procure even a kilogram of rice from a farmer in India, India is supposed to be subsidizing to the extent of 17 rupees and 48 paise per kilogram, which is astounding. In fact, I may mention that
I had once remarked to a colleague of mine from a developed country who was a staunch opponent of this proposal that we are really lucky that this reference price was fixed as 1986-88 and not as 1786 and 88, because then the subsidy would have been even more mind-boggling. The basic point which Dr. Hoda has raised is that subsidies have to be benchmarked against current prices. If I buy a pen for, let's say, from the producer for 10 rupees, and the market price is also 10 rupees, there is no subsidy. If the market price is 9 rupees and I buy it for 10 rupees, there is a subsidy element of 1 rupee. That is the point which was sought to be addressed way back in 94-95 through the agreement on agriculture and the other agreements. Now, as Dr. Hoda mentioned, in many cases, the subsidy element for the European Union, which was the main target of this provision, because the market price support scheme was being utilized mainly by the European Union, in those days I think the European communities, and not so much by the US. And that is why we had this phenomenon in the 80s of mountains of butter and lakes of wine. And that was the main target. But it was very much in the scheme of things that there would be an automatic review of the agreement on agriculture in 5 years' time. And that was the genesis of the Doha round. It started from there because it was built in, the agenda was built in that there would be reform of agriculture. And from there people started adding things to the wish list, and the basket soon started overflowing, and today it is in a very sorry state of affairs when we don't really know whether we'll ever be able to conclude the Doha round. So on the issue of subsidies, the point that I wanted to make, and I would beg to differ very humbly from Professor Hoda's presentation. The 3rd October 2013 paper of the G33 mentions 2 variants of Article 18.4, which is basically about inflation adjustment, without mentioning 18.4, I think, if I recall, but it was very clear and it was explained at great length. And the genesis of this proposal was much earlier, in November 2012, and after that there were innumerable discussions in the WTO, and things were explained about inflation, about each country's inflation. At least 6 countries gave presentations: Indonesia, Philippines, China, India, Pakistan, and Egypt, to my mind. So it's not that solutions were not available before Bali. It's not that people did not realize that, yes, India and other countries had gone into this agreement of the Uruguay round and signed it with eyes and ears wide open. In fact, that was a phrase which was used. You signed this agreement with your eyes and ears wide open. Now you can't wriggle out of it without paying a price. So I said, how many times do you want me to pay a price on behalf of India? There was no answer. But the short point is that from 2012 November till Bali, there was no intention to arrive at any solution. There was no engagement. So it would be really, I think, putting the matter in perspective, that it was not because solutions were not there, available. In fact, one of the solutions is already there in the green box about income loss. How are income losses calculated? Which governments compensate? The 3-year average, Olympian average of the last 5 years' incomes is taken into account. If, for instance, this was not inflation adjusted, we would still be taking the 86, 88 incomes. and any fall of 30% below that income would have triggered off subsidization by governments. People realized at the time of the euro go around that it would have been impossible. 86, 88 incomes of farmers, annual incomes. If you reference it according to that, then every year governments in the West would end up paying subsidies. So it was the last 3 years. For instance, this is 2014. So you take up to 2013, you go back 5 years from 2008 or 9, and you take the 3 best years. You leave out the highest income, the lowest income, and take the middle 3. And the average of that, if the income falls 30% below that, you have a right to subsidize. So if that was the logic provided in the very green box, it stands to reason that it was perhaps an oversight. And I may mention today that one of my predecessors, who was Ambassador Zutshi, had mentioned 3 issues in the concluding phase of the Uruguay round negotiations, and this was one of them. He said that this would pose a problem for India and many other developing countries because of the inexorable march of inflation. Well, unfortunately, Peter Sutherland had promised that he would find a technical fix to this, which could have been found. But in the rush of things, when Professor Hoda may recall, he was negotiating on behalf of India, this fell through the cracks, and today we unfortunately are faced with the same problem 20 years later, trying to solve this. So the short point that I am wanting to make is that technical fixes are available. There are more than one. 2 of them have been mentioned by Professor Hoda. The third one is, just take this example of the Olympian average of the last 5 years. Take the 3-year average of the prices. If you don't want to take the current international prices, take the international prices Olympian average of the last 5 years, 3 years average. There are many solutions. Quite a few of them have been raised in an e-booklet which the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development has brought out 2 weeks ago from Geneva. I was there at a seminar which they organized. And because of this impasse, I think for the first time people have realized that this is a real problem. This is a real life problem. And it does not only concern companies and firms, it concerns the average man on the street. That this is something which will not pass the test of rationality if we continue to calculate subsidies based on 86, 88 reference figures. So we need a solution, and Professor Hoda has given 2 solutions. There are others. The main point that I wanted to make here is whether there is a willingness to look at a solution, to find a solution, and if so, when. Because inflation adjustment, taking the international prices of the year, the average international prices of the immediate preceding year, that is something which anybody can download from the computer in a jiffy. So solutions are there, but is the inclination, the willingness there to find a solution? I am not very sure about that. And that brings me to the second part of my presentation about the political economy of the whole thing. The matter was first raised in 2005 by the African group, this issue about the calculation of subsidies. It was taken up by the G20 group of countries, and a formal proposal was made on this. The G20 group of countries, in case people don't recall because things have been forgotten about Geneva, it is coordinated by Brazil, and there are about 23 members in that. That was the genesis of this proposal, and then negotiations took place. It underwent 4 revisions, and ultimately it sort of stabilized in December 2008. And all the countries and there are only 3 countries effectively which are opposing this, trying to find a a solution quickly. All of them then were around the table. I was also fortunately one of those negotiators from Delhi who was sent. So I also was part of it. And this figured in the revised draft modalities the fourth revised draft modalities of 6th December 2008. But be that as it may, that was the starting point of the G33 in 2012. Let's start from there. But that was forgotten. The G33 acknowledged that, all right, if that cannot be accepted, then let us look at other solutions. But there was no engagement. So the issue is that the staunchest opponent of this finding a solution today is in the middle of perhaps another midterm election. In 2 years there will be election for the head of state, and there are murmurs in trade circles that the main agenda is not anywhere close to Geneva. It is in the Asia-Pacific region in the form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So if that is correct, I don't know whether it is, but there is from all the statements emanating from the capital, we understand that that is priority number one. If that is so, we don't really know whether a push would be there or not to try to solve this problem. And before I conclude, I would like to mention another issue about people losing interest in the WTO, losing interest from in the fruits which can perhaps be harvested from the WTO agreements at the moment. Trade facilitation, as you all are aware, was one of the 4 issues which was raised in 1996, mainly by the European Union at that point of time. And of course, it could not be accepted in Singapore, in the ministerial. It got raised in Seattle, but in any case, the ministerial ended in a fiasco. In 2001, in the Doha ministerial meeting, there was a long discussion on this, I've been told. And this was relegated to the background as, yes, these issues, we could look at them, provided we do enough research and we find out that there is going to be benefits for everybody. Because, the name may suggest something, but inside, the details may be entirely different. Because from trade, if you just look at the expression trade, it means both imports and exports. And if we go by the figures that are being bandied about today, there is one figure which is being quoted most often, is that there would be $1 trillion of additional trade in goods. Now, what is the size of the global volume of trade at the moment? It's approximately $16 to $17 trillion. And $1 trillion, there would be a significant addition to the existing flow of trade, and it would be to the extent of some 6-7%. If that is correct, what is going to be the cost? The cost has been calculated by some of the aid providing countries as varying from $3 to $7 million per country. That's all. India is not one of those countries which is asking for financial assistance, but this technical stroke financial assistance package, if it is, let us take it at its extreme as $7 million per country. Let us make an assumption that 100 out of the 160 members of the WTO seek this assistance. It will be $700 million. $7 million, 100 countries, $700 million. For $700 million, you get additional trade worth $1 trillion? I think somebody needs to look at the arithmetic. This is the kind of miscalculations which are being bandied about. The second point about trade facilitation is that countries like India, we have, of course, done quite a bit in this direction on our own. But the ones which are big traders, China, for instance, the European Union countries, the US, Japan, Australia, they have done all of it, of course. So they are not going to change or any of their regulations very much. And the cost will have to be borne by these countries, which are big traders in any case. India is not a big trader, but we have also done most of it. So the cost component may not be very high for us, but it is for the smaller countries. And it is for behind the border improvements in import facilitation. We're not speaking about roads, we're not speaking about ports, we're not speaking about electricity provisioning for industries which are export oriented. We're speaking about customs people, make more people, put more people on the job, have more computers, have simplified procedures. Of course, it is going to be of benefit. But if we take these figures that there would be a substantial gain to international trade, the countries which have already put these things in place, there will not be additional imports into them. It will be overall gain, and at what cost? Whose cost? So there is a lack of enthusiasm amongst many developing countries about this package of trade facilitation. People are not against trade facilitation, but it has to be a balanced package which benefits everyone. It can't be that I get some technical assistance, I improve my procedures, I put more men on the job, more machines, I build infrastructure only for import facilitation, and I bear the recurring costs, and I end up importing more. I may be a primary product exporter, but I need other infrastructure. So it is a mixed bag. I'm not saying it is good, I'm not saying it is bad. It is definitely not bad. But for each country, the benefits that will accrue has to be evaluated, and the country has to see a benefit. So that is why there isn't great enthusiasm. And if you look at the trade facilitation agreement in its final form, you will find that barring a few proposals, most of them from India, about customs cooperation and other things, there are hardly any proposals from any other developing country. None from Africa, in fact. They're mostly from developed countries. So it shows that there was this lack of enthusiasm in the way it was constructed, in the way it was negotiated, in the way it was put forward. So that is there by way of the lack of interest, if I may put it in these strong words. Now, my final point is, yes, if we reach a solution, which I hope we should, because there should be an initiative but from both sides, and there should be a real engagement, and it can be sorted out, I'm sure, in a week's time. It's not something which is rocket science. Very simple. The inclination should be there from both sides, and once we reach that agreement on the agriculture issue and trade facilitation, let's say, goes ahead, what after that in the WTO? That is the big question which is staring at us from the distance. That, if we cross this first bridge, we will come to that problem later.
I think many of you have the background of knowledge about the trade negotiations, and you would have understood more than others what we are talking about. There are others who may not be as well aware of the fine points that are being discussed at Geneva, and you might not have benefited that much. But all of you are most welcome to ask questions in order to elucidate the issues further, and also evaluate the suggestions that some of us have given. So the floor is open for questions. Please identify yourself and ask the question. Yes, first you
textile industry. I'm from the textile field. I've been in the field for a long time. My simple question is, assuming that the two agreements we are discussing, agriculture and TFA, both of these get sorted out as Mr. Dasgupta hopes that it will be. If that happens, the other packages, which are more or less in the green box already, will automatically get through, or you will reopen the whole tariff and other things which have been discussed from 2001 onwards.
Thank you. Let's take the first three questions and then from there.
Myself, Manoj, the Reuters news agency. My question is, like India's current procurement policies, particularly for the rice and wheat in the last few years, have created such a surplus in the domestic market that so much stocks are with us, and which has been claimed to be by many LDC countries that have been dumped in the African or Middle East or other markets, and which are hurting their agriculture policies. How can we justify our current procurement policy? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Good evening. I am Ashok Vishwadas, Chairman, Commission on Agriculture Cost and Prices. To me, this issue of inflation taking on board is fairly straightforward and simple. It's a question of arithmetic any undergraduate student can do. I'm getting a sense from both the speaker that there is a purpose behind which some stumbling blocks are there. It's not, I mean, rationality demands it has to be, inflation has to be taken on board. But what are those forces which prevents this? That is A. And B, when the agreement AOA was signed in January 1995, it was signed with ears and eyes open, wide open. How come India committed that kind of blunder to agree to this kind of very, very trivial mistake of agreeing to reference period of 86 to 88 without taking that into account?
Thank you. I think I'll request Jayant to try to answer Mr. D.K. Nair's question, and I'll try to answer the other two questions. Jayant?
Thank you, sir. The scenario that you are presenting is indeed very promising, that trade facilitation and food security will both go through. Yes, I do hope so, very sincerely, before the year end. But I'm not very sure that the other 7 or 8 issues, including the LDC issues, the duty-free, quota-free, and cotton, which will call for a great deal of reform in the US policy. And the US has just entered into an agreement with Brazil, which many WTO experts are criticizing as being non-WTO compliant, because whatever you do can't be a cozy bilateral arrangement to overlook a clear violation of the WTO discipline. So the issues are cotton, duty-free, quota-free. The issues are export competition, export credit, because in the export competition pillar of agriculture, there were 4 different things. One was export subsidies, which was supposed to be phased out by 2013 December, which didn't get phased out. There was export credit, there was food aid, and if I recall, there was another element in that. So I'm not very sure that that will go through all that easily. Once we cross this hump, it may not be possible for us to go much further without real engagement and willingness to conclude the Doha round.
The other aspect that you raised is about how the government of India and others, they ignored these red lines that were obvious at that time. Now, the reason given for freezing the external reference price at the level of 86, 88 was that certain countries, most notably the European Union, had large bank balance in monetary terms of subsidies that they had scheduled and which they were going to bring down by 20% over the implementation period. So the idea was that let inflation also erode into their bank balance. That was the idea. The negotiators at that time did not focus so much on the fact that this rule that was built into the agreement for giving effective liberalization vis-a-vis these developed countries who are having large subsidies was going to affect the developing countries also who were subjected to the 10% de minimis requirement. Now to that it was argued that look at 18.4, we are providing that in such cases we will take up on a case-by-case basis, individual cases and agree to. Now, which is something that today, in today's circumstances, we feel that this case-by-case approach is not a good thing. Even in normal government machinery, case-by-case approach is considered to be a bad thing. And in multilateral agreements, case-by-case approach is very bad because then politics come to the picture. And it is, as I said, the antithesis of what